Good afternoon, everyone. It's 2:30 afternoon, Wednesday afternoon. We just want to thank you for being here today. And we are really excited to have you here today. So my name is Leticia Garcia. I'm Director of Support Services, and we're going to get started right now. But first things first, if you are the proud owner of a cell phone, turn it off, please. Put it on vibrate for our presenter so we don't get interruptions. Also, I just want to welcome you. If this is the first time you're here joining us for the Carmel Foundation Wednesday programs. Thank you for being here today. And if you're interested in becoming a member of the Carmel Foundation, we have some newsletters and membership applications on the back table, and I'll be happy to later over here to answer any questions you have about becoming a member. Now let's move on to what's coming up next. On July 17th, Monterey Bay Village Looking Ahead Wellness Series, Cognitive Aspects of a Stroke. That sounds scary, right? Deborah Suniga, speech-language pathologist from VNA and Hospice, will discuss what happens to the brain during a stroke. She would also explain best practices for recovery and what to do now before it's too late, on what to do to keep a healthy and happy brain. We all want that, so I expect all of you to come back on that day. Also on July 24th, there's no Wednesday program. Did you guys know that the Carmel Foundation throws a party for our 90-year-olds or better every year? So now you have something to look forward to, right? Yeah. When you're 90, you're going to get an invitation, especially from the Carmel Foundation. Also, on July 31st, reflections on human spaceflight. What single planet species do not survive? Join former NASA astronaut James H. Newman, PhD. He's going to be sharing a recollection of stories from his 23 years at NASA, including flights to the International Space Station and Hubble Space Telescope. This will definitely be a presentation to join. And you heard it from me. If you want to be here for that presentation and get your seat, show up a little bit earlier. We only have capacity for 100 people, so after 100 people, we're going to have to turn people away. So a little bit earlier than 2:30, that's what I meant to say. And now it is my pleasure to introduce to you our next presenter, Dr. Chris Hasegawa.
Very good.
Thank you. I had to practice with him first. Chris, Denise, Matthew, and Leslie here. Hasegawa joined the Monterey community in 1995 when Dr. Hasegawa was recruited as one of the founding faculty at CSUMB Monterey Bay. His wife Denise is a nurse at CHOMP's cardiac rehabilitation program. Matthew and Leslie both graduated from Monterey High School and have moved into their own careers. Together, they have embraced the Japanese American community as part of the El Estero Presbyterian Church, the Monterey Buddhist Temple, and the Japanese American Citizens League. Although Chris' PhD is in sciences, he has been a featured speaker about the Japanese American community at the Pacific Grove Celebration of Life and the OLLI program, as well as speaking at the local middle and high school about the experience of his family during World War II and their forced relocation to Arizona. Dr. Hasegawa is a retired professor, department chair, and dean at CSUMB. Please put your hands together and help me welcome Dr. Hasegawa.
Oh, thanks. That's a very nice introduction. So as she said, I have my daughter Leslie here because she's better than a remote control. And she can think for herself, she can do all these things that I need her to do. And at 3:45, she's going to say, Dad, so that we can do a little bit of question and answers, okay? So as we mentioned, I'm coming here as part of the OLLI at CSUMB program. OLLI stands for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. And it's a thing that I started when I was still a dean over at CSU Monterey Bay, which is an educational program for people, this is my tagline, and I'm very proud of it, who are 55 or better, right? So if you're 55 or better, then you can come and sign up for programs, you can pay a fee and then take a number of different kinds of things. So far in the program, I've taught classes on jazz, music. We teach a glee club. Actually, in December, the glee club's going to come here, and we're going to all sing together. I teach classes on how the brain works, because I'm really a neuroscientist. I'm a biochemist, and I talk about what happens in the brain. One of the talks that we'll be doing later on this year is what's happening in somebody's brain when they're starting to move into dementia, and how can you as a loved one help those folks. And so we'll be doing something about that. This next season, I'm doing a talk on Star Trek versus Star Wars. And we'll be having some fun with that. So anyhow, take a look at OLLI at CSUMB. We'll tell you more about that as we go along. But that's what the program's about. And we're glad to be here as part of it. So I want to tell you a little bit about who I am. I'm going to give you a little Japanese history, not Japanese American, but Japan history, just for context. And then I'm going to talk about the first Japanese in Monterey. And by the way, you'll notice I'm going to be very careful about saying Japanese and Japanese Americans, because that's part of the story. Then we're going to talk about World War II and the relocation and how that impacted all of our families. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about my family situation. So if I get a little emotional during that part, Leslie's going to throw some water on me and I'll be fine. Then we'll talk a little bit about the period between World War II and now. And then we're going to end talking about the Obon Festival and something that's coming up, and I'll tell you more about that. So this is going to be fun. If you have any questions, just raise your hand at any point and I will call on you. So my long and winding road started out, go ahead, Les. When I started college, I decided I was going to go, well, no, that's wrong. My mom said I was going to be a doctor. I don't know if anybody else recognizes that story. So I decided I wanted to learn what doctors do. So I became an EMT and worked on an ambulance for a while. And after doing that for a little while, go ahead, next slide. I decided, well, that wasn't what I wanted to do. So I was playing the saxophone, and I decided I'm going to be a jazz musician. And so I'm playing the saxophone. We finally got good enough so that we're getting jobs in clubs, and lo and behold, I'm allergic to cigarette smoke. I'm so allergic to cigarette smoke that I can't breathe. When you can't breathe, you're not no good as a saxophone player. So I naturally turned my attention to biochemistry and said, well, I want to learn what makes people allergic to cigarette smoke, and particularly I want to learn about what happens in people's brain when they use drugs, because in the jazz scene I met some people that were using drugs, and some of them were great and some of them weren't. So that was the research that I was doing, and I worked my way almost to a PhD in biochemistry, but the research consisted of addicting rats and mice to different kinds of drugs, chopping off their heads, taking out their brains, grinding them up, and then doing biochemical assays, which was fascinating work. But it was kind of hard on my heart. I felt bad for those little boogers. So I stopped that and went off to, well, they said because you've cut the heads off of rats and mice, you'd be a great junior high science teacher. So I taught science for a while. I taught that at the junior high level, then I taught 3rd and 5th grade, then I taught high school. And then I decided, well, I want to go on, and I tried to be a principal for a little while, but discipline, stuff in middle school was not going to be my thing. So I went on and got a PhD in science education, where we started to learn about how do drugs and alcohol affect the brain. And really it's about how do you explain complex things to people that don't have the scientific background that I have. And so in doing those kinds of talks, I started getting around the country, and I found to my dismay that there were numbers of people that were still saying to me, those Japs got stuck in the camps because they were going to destroy our country. And that kind of wore on me after a little while. I was living in Oregon, and I was going out to some of these rural counties, and they were saying, well, that was the right thing to do. And I'm like, no, it wasn't. And so I started putting together talks. And I got my degree at the University of Oregon. Go to the next one, you know. So anyhow, I went back and I started putting together talks about Japanese and Japanese Americans. And when I moved to Monterey County, I started to pull together some of that information. And so that's what I'm going to present to you now. So in Japan, we're going back to 1600. At the end of in 1600, the late 1590s, what was happening in Japan was that there were all these different feudal places where each kind of castle, each region had its own leader, and they all said that they gave attention to the emperor, but they didn't really. You know, they were just running their own little fiefdoms, and they had all of these all over Japan. And each of them had their samurai, their knights that would go out and they would protect them and fight for them. So they had all these little fiefdoms all over in Japan. And in the early 1600s was the first time that Japan kind of started to come together as one thing. And the emperor said, we need somebody to run this, but I'm busy doing what I'm doing, which is eating and having people dance for him and those kinds of things. So he said, we're going to put in a premier, a shogun. And some of you might have seen the TV show Shogun, or Shogun. And that person was the person that actually got there in charge of that. The way that that impacts my family is that the Tajiris, my mom's family, were living very peacefully on the bottom of the country on Kyushu, which is, go ahead to the next slide. So if you see down here, and I'm going to come up here for a minute. Here's a map of Japan, and then at the very bottom of it is the island of Kyushu. And this is a blow-up of Kyushu. My mom's family came from Kagoshima, and you see this nice bay that they had there. So my mom's family, the Tajiris, were peacefully farming down there. And there were two factions fighting for the shogunate, two groups that wanted to be in charge of Japan. And one group said, I'm at a disadvantage because I don't have as much money as the other guys. So they thought it would be a good idea to go and attack Korea and then get up into China, Ming Dynasty, and get some of that money, and they would come back rich. Great plan. Great plan. So my relatives living in Kagoshima got caught up by the people that were headed over to Korea, and they said, you're nice farmers, but we really need foot soldiers. So you are now foot soldiers in our army, and you go into South Korea. So my mom's family stopped being farmers and got on ships and went over here as foot soldiers. And they said there were so many ships that kind of covered the bay. So they sent over a lot of people. My ancestors, when they got into that valley and started moving up through Korea, found out that the Koreans had discovered or had developed stirrups. And for those of you that know anything about horse riding, you know that stirrups is a pretty important thing because it gives you stability when you come down with your spike and you want to run through somebody. And so the Japanese general said, I've got a great solution to that problem. These guys are coming down out of the hills, spiking all of our guys. What we're going to do is we're going to take a samurai sword, we're going to tape it to the end of a long stick. When they attack, you ground it, and then you point the stick into the chest of the horse. That's what the ground soldiers were supposed to do. As you would probably expect, most of the ground soldiers said, the heck with this, and took off. The Tajiri family was evidently very steadfast in doing what they were supposed to do. And so by the end of the time that all of the Japanese soldiers got massacred, they were one of the few families that were still foot soldiers in that role. When they were defeated, the Japanese came back to Kagoshima, just in a few ships now. And when they got back there, the leader, the general, was told, well, you have two choices. You can kill yourself in seppuku, or we're going to kill you. You know? So he decided I would do this honorable thing. But the last thing that the general can do is he can help a family move from being a peasant to samurai. So then he said to the Tajiri clan, you are now samurai. Well, that was great, because now my mom's family had this name, had this status, but had no lord, right? Because there's nobody in charge of the army anymore because he just killed himself. So they're samurai, but they don't have anybody to fight for. So they became farmer samurai, right? And they continued to farm that land until much later on. And I tell you that to say that there were other instances of samurai that had been fighting for different generals who had gotten killed or defeated, and they're just kind of hanging out, right? Okay, back up one, Wes. So at the end of the attacks on Korea, there are noble families, the samurai families, that don't have any place to go. They don't have anybody to serve. The Japan in the first shogunate is moving into an isolationist society so that nobody from Europe can come into the country. Nobody from Japan can leave the country. They just want to be that. They don't want to go back to Korea. They don't want to go to China. They sure don't want anybody except for the Dutch and the Chinese ships to come into port. And only those two countries, because they don't get off the ship. They just unload the stuff and go back. So that's okay. We'll take their stuff, but we don't want any people going back and forth. So it's an increased isolationist policy in Japan. And Japan is finally getting unified. All those little fiefdoms are coming together. And these are the two generals that were fighting for the shogunate. And Toyotomi was the one that my mom's family followed, and he was defeated, right? So you don't need to memorize those names. There are no quizzes at the end of this. Okay, go forward to left. So in 1635, they have what they call the Sakoku Edict, which is the formal proclamation that no Japanese can leave Japan and no Europeans can enter Japan. They can bring stuff, just those two countries, but nobody else. In 1638, having had some Europeans in into Japan, some Japanese were Christians. And in this rebellion, the Christians were complaining that they were getting treated unfairly, and it was beaten down. That whole thing about Christians being treated unfairly was said, it's okay, you know. My family, the Hasegawas, the Tajiris, both happen to be Christian. So they're not all that happy either. And then in 1703, some of the Ronin, and Ronin are those samurai that don't have any master. They were ordered to commit seppuku. And I mention this mostly because if you've ever seen the movie 47 Ronin, that's what this is about, this period of time. But also to impress with you again, that there's a bunch of people there that are not really happy with what's going on. Okay? Next slide. In 1853, Ranald MacDonald is found on Rishiri Island, which is one of the small islands to the south of Japan, and is the first European to kind of live in Japan. And for those of you that saw the movie Shogun, that was Richard Chamberlain. I think he had a different name in the movie. But, and so this is kind of the breaking point where the Europeans kind of come back. And in 1853, Commodore Perry of the United States signs a treaty ending that Sakoku period, so the isolation is broken. And in 1868, they have what they call the Meiji Reformation, which is when Japan started to move from a feudal system to a more modern system. And one of the things that happened during that time that I noticed, is they wanted to deliver mail, right? But to deliver mail, you need last names. And a lot of the peasants, merchant class, didn't have last names. If you were a samurai, if you were royalty, if you were, you had a last name. But the peasants, not so much. So they said, we want to deliver mail. So all you people at the end of the canyon, Hasegawa, There's like 8 pages of Hasegawas in the Tokyo Photo. All you people on top of the mountain, Omoto, you know. So there's whole areas of people that have the same last name, and there's tons of us. It's like Smith and Jones in the United States, or Brown, or you know, that kind of thing. So the nice thing is that Hasegawa, which means end of a canyon, it means that's where they were from. But there are lots of them. It caused some, in a little bit I'm going to tell you about my mom and dad. The Tajuris were samurai farmers, right? And the Hasegawas were peasants who just got a name because of where they lived. And even in the United States, that meant something to my grandfather Tajuri. Not so much to my grandfather Hasegawa. You know, it was a big deal. So, middle of the 1800s was when all of this end of the feudal system takes place. By 1853, in the United States, okay, shifting gears now, in 1853, about 600 fishing Chinese are living here fishing abalone at Point Lobos. And the Chinese have been coming over in great numbers to this point. In 1879, California passed a referendum that voted to end Chinese immigration into California. No more Chinese can come into California. And in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act all over the United States was put in place, and it stayed in place until 1943, so there was no legal immigration of Chinese from 1882 to 1943. But the people in the United States still needed cheap labor. They couldn't bring in the Chinese anymore, so, dun, 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 by the 1880s, Japanese immigrants, and this is driven mostly by farm labor, initially in Hawaii, and then they were not treated well in Hawaii, so then they decided they'd move on to the mainland and see if they got treated any better here. The Japanese started to immigrate. And so that's really when the Japanese first started appearing here. And when they first started appearing here, because of the stories about Hawaii, what had happened to the farm workers in Hawaii, my great-grandfather, who was the third son, was put on a committee from the province of Hiroshima to go and see what's happening to the Japanese in the United States. And so he comes to the United States and he sees that in California there are farm workers, but there's potential. And he thinks, oh, I gotta tell you, third sons in Japan means that the family property is gonna go to the first son, right? He's gonna probably hire the second son as his lieutenant. What does the third son get? Not much of anything, right? So he's a third son, and he's not gonna get much of anything. He says, my opportunity is to come back to the United States with as much gold as I can get and buy some property, because the guys coming across on the ships, Japanese sailors, are all getting scurvy. But they only get scurvy when they when they go back from the United States. Coming here, they have lemons and vegetables and things like that, and they're healthy. But going back, they get scurvy because they don't have any fruits and vegetables with them. So his idea, my grandfather, says, I'm going to come here and I'm going to buy land and I'm going to grow oranges and lemons, and I'm going to sell them to these ship owners so they can have their sailors be healthy on the way back, and I'm going to make a fortune. So he comes back here and finds out that the land that's available to him is not, well, let me start over. Land is expensive, more than he thought. But there is land, you know, in California we have the system of ditches where they bring water to the farms. Grandpa said, look, there's these ditches that go to here. If they extend it rationally, it's going to go this way. I'm going to buy this property over here that the ditch doesn't run to right now, because I can get that for cheap. But eventually, they're going to run water out to those places. So he did that. He bought this property, and then he invited, now actually, this is my great-grandfather. This is my dad's grandpa that did all of this. And then he invited my dad's father, my grandfather, to come, and he says, you can be the president of the Hasegawa company. And he did. He came. Having been trained as a foreign diplomat, he got a degree in law at one of the most prestigious universities in Japan. And so He comes because he's going to be the president of the company. He doesn't realize that the only other office in the company is the chairman of the board. That's his dad. Right? And the job of the president is to walk behind a cart with a bucket of water on it and take a bucket of water and water orange trees one at a time over 60 acres. So he does that continuously for a little while later. I need to tell you, from a personal standpoint, my brothers and sisters always describe Grandpa Hasegawa as very unhappy, usually drunk, and kind of abusive. And I always feared him. You know, in my head, I'm the youngest of 5. In my head, he was the boogeyman. But after hearing this story, I would have been pretty upset too, you know. So here he is, watering this plants over and over again, waiting for his sons to get old enough so that they can take over that work for him. Back to my story here. 1800s, 1880s, the Japanese immigrants are coming here to work farm. 1895, you start to see the first sharecrop contracts in the Salinas Valley, and that means that the Japanese Americans are saying to American landowners, we're going to take this piece of property, we're going to farm it for you, and we're going to split the take, essentially is the way that goes. And so that started happening as early as 1895. Okay, next slide. Okay, now I got to give you a little bit of terminology because I'm going to be throwing this stuff out and you need to know what I'm talking about. In the United States, we refer to the first generation that was born in Japan and comes here as Issei. So that would have been my grandfather because he was born in Japan and then he came here. My family is confusing because it's also my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather also was born in Japan and then came here and lived the rest of his life, except for one point where he went back and got a wife and came back. Okay. So we actually have 2 generations of Issei at the top of our family. And then Nisei is the second generation. That's my mom and dad. And they are the ones that built everything that we're so proud to have. As Sansei, we're the 3rd generation. And I need to back up. The Nisei, a lot of them came to the United States because they were from those situations that I was describing. They came over here because they didn't have anything else that they were going to be able to benefit from in Japan. And the Hasegawas particularly, even though they were landowners, at the time that they opened up foreign trade in Japan, they started bringing in rice from Korea. And guess what? The rice from Korea was cheaper than the rice that they could grow in Japan. So all of the farmers that worked for them left. They went to the United States. And so even though my family was seen as wealthy because they owned land, nothing was growing on that land. And so they were having a tough time. They came to the United States because of economic issues, and especially my grandfather, who was 3rd son. Other folks came because, like the Tajuris came, because they were samurai beholden to no master. And at some point, they were going to be asked to kill themselves. So they decided that was not a good thing, so they'd come to the United States. So there are things happening in Japan that cause people to exit over here. I'm a Sansei, I'm a 3rd generation, only speak English. My dad told me not to learn Japanese because Japanese got put in those camps during World War II. So there's no benefit in you learning Japanese. There's only downside to that. So don't learn Japanese. Leslie, my lovely daughter here, is a Yonsei. She's a 4th generation. And then there are people that are Kibe who were born in the United States, but then they got sent back to Japan to be educated, and then came back to the United States. And they have just a little different slant on things as well. My mom's actually Kibe. She went back to Japan with her brother who had a deformed ear. They were going to have plastic surgery done in Japan. And then when they, right before they came back, her youngest brother, who was about 5, got sick and died. And in paying for the doctor's bills and the burial and all of those kinds of things, they didn't have enough money to bring my mom and her brother, oldest brother, back. So they stayed in Japan, went to high school in Japan, and then came back to the United States after that. So technically, she's Kibe. Okay, got those terms? No quiz. OLLI says we don't give homework, we don't give quizzes, we just want to educate. So Here we are, okay. So here they are farming. This is in the Salinas Valley, and you had people that were farm workers, just like the Mexican farm workers that are here now, and they were filling much that same kind of a role. Next slide. In California, California passes the Alien Land Law of 1913, prohibiting aliens ineligible for citizenship from owning land and adding a prohibition against aliens ineligible for citizenship from possessing long-term leases. So as of 1913, the Japanese cannot own land, they cannot have sharecropping anymore. The Japanese respond to this by saying, my son, Peter, my dad, was born in the United States. He's a United States citizen. He's the one that has a lease. Dad's like 3 years old at this time, right? He's the one that has the lease with the company, and that's okay by the law. And then eventually the United States said, no, you can't do that because he's not of majority age, you know, he can't do anything. So they said, we formed the Hasegawa Corporation. And the Hasegawa Corporation is a business, and as a business entity, they can own the property. But, and so they had some ways of getting property bought, but it was much harder for them at that point. And so remember I was talking about 1895 when they started sharecropping, 1913 when they couldn't do that anymore. So there's a little window, and in between, next slide, some of the Japanese farmers were able to buy farms, like this one in Salinas, the Sakauis, who were able to buy property legally in that little window, and they were owning it. And that's a Japanese farmer that's been there for generations and still farms that land. Well, some of it anyhow. So, next slide. So in the United States, it really starts with abalone. In 1895, this guy named Otosaburo Noda, he's got this company called the Pacific Improvement Company. And the Pacific Improvement Company has a contract with railroad, Southern Pacific, right, to clear land. So he's clearing land over on the Monterey by the shore. And he looks out and he sees Point Lobos. And he goes down there, and there are these Chinese fishermen that are pulling abalone out with a fishing pole. And in Japan, that's unheard of. There's no abalone that shallow. And he says, literally, there are fields of abalone to walk with amongst your toes. And abalone is a big seller in Japan. So he decides that let's get into the abalone trade. In 1895, they call this fellow Mr. Kodani. And if any of you have lived in the Monterey area, you've probably known somebody from the Kodani family. They came, and he's a biologist specializing in abalone. And he says, this is a gold mine. This is a gold mine. So he starts to do that. Mr. Noda founds the first sardine cannery on Cannery Row in 1902, and they're off to the races. These abalone divers, go ahead, next picture. Here they are, standing out, and you see Mr. Kodani standing there going, this is good. There's a lot of abalone out there. And you see here one of the divers who's in a hard shell suit, and he would go down and he would pry up abalones and bring them up, and they would can them and send them off to Japan. They were doing very well. It starts out actually not with these guys, but the first guys that they send down in the next picture, oh, well, this is just to show you what that looks like. But in the next picture, see, they started out with these guys because they would go down in Japan and just free dive to get the abalone up, but you can only stay down for about 2 minutes. And they found out that the water on our side of the Pacific Ocean is a lot colder than the water on the Japan side, right? And so when they went in there, these guys are freezing their little tukishes off. That's a technical term, tukishes. And they're having a hard time staying down for their 2 minutes, much less getting them to go back down. So then they brought in the hard suits, and these guys started diving for abalone that way. So this was a big industry for them. Tsunetaro Oda, some of you might know Larry Oda in Monterey. This is his dad, and he started the Moss Landing whaling station, where they were able to bring in whales and be able to, cut them up and do what they needed to do with the whales so that they could can whales. And then they started the Sea Pride Packing Corporation. Anybody recognize that building? So right down there on Cannery Road was the Sea Pride canning organization, where they were able to bring in fish that they caught and then ship it off to Japan and Asia and places like that. And here's the picture. The Oda family, for those of you, if any of you know Larry, this is Larry. Larry was the president of the JCL. I'm going to tell you about that in just a minute. I just like the picture. And then there was another company called Higashi and Company, who also during this time was doing the same sort of thing and became very big, but they got into real estate. So at some point, and one of the ways that the Japanese Americans started really interacting with the Sicilians and the Italians down there on the wharf was baseball. They both liked it. Back up. Oh. Oh, I thought you were telling me to hurry up. Dad? Okay. Well, yeah. Anyhow, so they're all playing baseball together. And the Japanese Americans say, if we hadn't played baseball with these guys, we wouldn't have had the relationship that becomes so important later on. So they're playing lots of baseball. And then, go ahead, slip to the next one. And then there were some restaurants where this guy, Ernest, and I'm trying to remember his last name, but he's actually German, becomes the first guy on the wharf to, sell abalone in his restaurant. So he breads the steaks, they pound the heck out of it, breads it, and sells it in his restaurant, and people flock there. And it's all because of these Japanese abalone fishermen. So you notice at the bottom, his sign says, "Auf Wiedersehen," because he's German, right? But he's benefiting from the abalone that the Japanese are finding and really up for him. So he becomes famous. In what we call Japantown, you know where Jack's Park is, the baseball park downtown? And here's where the sports center would be, right here. Look at all these black places. All of these black buildings were Japanese-owned properties, companies, stores and things like that, down in what used to be called Japanese Town in Monterey at that point. So it's quite a substantial set of holdings. Okay, next one. They get so big that eventually they invite the Prince of Japan to come. So here he is at Point Lobos with most of the Japanese American community around him. And together they raise funds and actually build what they call the Nihonjin Kai. So that means Japanese Hall. You know, the people that are Japanese, their hall. And now we call it the JACL Hall. JACL stands for Japanese American Citizens League. And during World War II, they started that to say, we're not getting treated very well as citizens. You notice the word citizens in that name. So now we have the JCL Hall. You see it downtown. It's right across from Jack's Park. And every so often you'll walk by it and you'll hear Leslie and my wife and the other taiko players going, boom, ga-dum, 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 ga-dum. That's coming out of this place. Next slide. They also built Alistero Presbyterian Church. Alistero Presbyterian Church before 1941 was called the Japanese Christian Church. But when World War II started, they decided not such a good name. So they were on Alistero Street, so they became Alistero Presbyterian Church. And same thing happened to the church in Salinas and the church in Watsonville. They all changed their name from the Japanese American Presbyterian Church of Watsonville to, I forget what the name of the street is, but whatever the name of the street is, that's what they named it, yeah. So, and this particular church building, half of it was originally brought from Europe, brick by brick, with directions, and they built it back up here. And you have to remember that during that time, that pond across the street in Denison Park, That water came right up to the front door. So they were slogging bricks from a church in Europe across that mud, and then reading the little directions on each brick and building the bottom part of this church. I think that's quite phenomenal. And then the other major building that went on during this time was the Monterey Peninsula Buddhist Temple. This is in Seaside, and it was up on the hill a little bit, and that's where people were able to come and practice that religion. In the Japanese community, there was some push and pull between the Buddhists and the Christians, but at some point, we're all Japanese Americans, and we operate as a community. So even though there was a little bit of that pushing and pulling in the early days of building these things, and they had to build 2 places instead of 1, turned out that the Japanese American community ended up working pretty well together because of World War II. So here's Pearl Harbor. On December 7th, 1941, the base at Pearl Harbor is attacked by Japanese pilots. Notice I said Japanese, not Japanese American. They're attacked by Japanese pilots. Next slide. And issued the next year was this Executive Order 9066, which said that all the Japanese Americans on the West Coast had to go inland because they were possible dangers to the country. Next slide. Executive Order 9066 says that restrictions can be placed on Japanese Americans and their movements because they look like the enemy. Executive Order 9066 allows the military to intern anyone that they felt necessary, which was everybody that was Japanese descent, whether or not they were American citizens or not. And then the Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt is given power to oversee this, and we see what DeWitt's leanings are as he goes before Congress, next slide, and says, a Jap is a Jap. They are a dangerous element. There is no way to determine their loyalty. It makes no difference whether he's an American. Theoretically, he's still a Japanese, and you can't change him by giving him a piece of paper. So this is the guy that's in charge of the relocation and gets put in charge of all of this. Next slide. So in 1941, let me introduce you to my parents. My mom was, at that time, 20 years old. She just graduated from Santa Rosa Junior College. She's living in Santa Maria. My father is working for his uncle, and they have a gas distribution company. So he comes around with a gas truck and fills up the gas tanks that people had on their farms at that time. So he would fill on it. And my mom writes in her diary, this Adonis of a man takes off his shirt and poses on top of the truck before pumping the gas into it. I love that. You know, after my mom passed away, we found in her belongings this red ribbon packet of letters that she and my dad had exchanged during World War II. And I never knew that my mom and dad were a little bit body. You know, they were talking about the shapes of their bodies and the touch of their lips, and then there were other things in there. And we're like, whoa, grandpa, you know, woo! So, anyhow, at that time, Dad was 26 years old and just been accepted to Southern California School of Optometry, but he never got to go because they got sent off to camp. We use the term, on December 8th, 1942, Grandpa Hasegawa was taken to a military prison in Bismarck, North Dakota. The only other people there were other Japanese American community leaders. Grandpa got taken there because he was teaching English to the other Japanese, which was seen as a subversive act. So he got taken there, and they were holding in Bismarck Japanese American community leaders and German officers that had been captured during the war. So he was held there until 1944, and he was never charged with anything. This is an example of what we would call concentration camps, where you're bringing together people that are of one nationality because they have that appearance, but they never get charged with anything. They just get put into prison for a while until it's convenient for the government to let them out. Grandpa Hasegawa, during the time that he was there, became blind in one eye, And he was never the commanding presence that he was previously in his life. And one of the reasons that he stayed there for so long was they kept having this statement that says, do you disown the Emperor of Japan? Do you renounce your citizenship to Japan? And he's saying, we're in the United States, I'm in prison. So if I sign this thing, where do I belong? Right? It's clear they're not going to be an American. They don't want me to be Japanese. So I don't know if I should sign this thing. And his friends are saying, sign it. Just sign it. Doesn't mean anything. You can go back with your family. And he said, just doesn't seem right. So he's out there till 1944 and comes back with blind in one eye and has asthma and emphysema. Next slide. This is my mom's dad when they say, you got to go. So they come and they put the little tags on him, and anything that you can carry, you get to take to camp with you. Next slide. In Monterey, you got sent to the Salinas Armory first. Here's the stuff that people thought they could carry. But they found out that no one was going to help them carry their stuff. It was what you personally could carry with you. And so a lot of the stuff got abandoned and left behind. Next one. And they got housed then at the Salinas Assembly Center, which is a fancy word for the horse track. And you see the track on the side, and you see the little places where they put the horses before. This is where the Japanese got moved into. They had almost 3 days to sell all of their belongings so that they could move back, get into these places. And a lot of them would try to sell as much as they could, but people knew that in 3 days they're going to be gone, so I can get it for free. Yeah.
So is that because of rodeo grounds?
Yeah, that's because of rodeo grounds. Right? Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I need a drink. Okay. From there, they get sent to the camps. And the camps, we use the word, Japanese Americans use this word camps. Kind of sounds like you're going to YMCA camp, right? When I was little, that's what I thought it was. You would go there and you'd make lanyards and that kind of stuff. But it turns out that these camps, these concentration camps, were places that all the Japanese Americans got sent because they wanted to make sure that they were not going to hazard any American installations. And you see the triangles, those are the places that they got sent to. My folks were in Poston. Gila River down below it in Arizona was where my wife's family was from. Manzanar on the east side of California was where most of the families from this area ended up going. If you've ever been to Manzanar, you know it's a tough place to live. Next slide. So they got loaded onto trains, they pulled down the lines, and they shipped these folks off. And next slide. This is what they found. The buildings were half built. They were expected to help build these things when they got there. There was gaps between the wood in building it so that the sand blows. If any of you have ever been in the Owens Valley, you know the wind blows nearly all the time. And so they would go to sleep at night, and the next morning they'd wake up with their outline in sand. Eventually, it gets colder than heck in the Owens Valley. It gets hotter than heck in the Owens Valley. These are people that live here because they like the climate, and then they get sent off to this really difficult place for them. So, you've heard about that. Life in the camps is, so most of these 110,000 people were sent for reasons of national security. And a lot of them are school-age kids, infants, and young adults not yet of voting age. I need to tell you that my mother-in-law was 7 when she got sent to the camps. And for her, she said, it was kind of neat because I didn't have to do chores anymore, right? And there were other Japanese kids around to play with. And there wasn't, they weren't running a farm, so I could spend time with my mom and dad. But that was not the common experience for most people. My mom and dad, being young adults, about ready to launch into their lives, couldn't. And Dad was going to go to the School of Optometry, but he couldn't get back to that part of California because he couldn't go past this certain line that they had built or constructed. And so he never got to do that. He was a great farmer and a great father, But I always wonder what would have happened if he'd gotten to be an optometrist, because that's what he was planning on doing. In the detention centers, families lived in substandard housing, had inadequate nutrition and health care, and had their livelihoods destroyed. Remember, everything that they had to be left behind. If they owned a store, it was left behind. If they owned a farm, it was left behind. And many continued to suffer psychologically long after their release, and I'm sure that's what happened to my grandfather Hasegawa. At Gila River, where my wife's folks were, there were 7,700 people crowded into a space designed for 5,000. They were housed in mess halls, recreation halls, and even latrines. For as many as 25 people lived in a space intended for 4. In desert camps, the evacuees met extremes of temperature. In winter, 35 below zero, and in summer brought temperatures as high as 115 degrees. Rattlesnakes and desert wildlife added danger to discomfort. So my mom and dad were in Poston. They were still dating. And dad was in camp 2 and mom was in camp 3, or vice versa. I could never keep that straight. And there's like 2 miles of desert in between. So my dad says, in order to court your mother, he would always say this whenever I had a girlfriend. In order to court your mother, I had to go across the desert and fight off the rattlesnakes and the scorpions and make it through the barbed wire and in through the barbed wire and court your mother. Then I had to go back at night because they were going to take count the next day. And with my dad, as with probably a lot of fathers, the snakes got bigger and the scorpions got more powerful. And it was uphill both ways, as he went on through his life. But it just kind of points out that, 1, it was a difficult place to live. 2, he says, by the end of the first 6 months, no more soldiers, right? Because they started out there with soldiers patrolling all this kind of stuff. Well, where are they going to go? So the soldiers got deployed other places, and the barbed wire wasn't such a big deal. There wasn't any place for them to go, except to another camp. So, it became much easier for him. Next slide. Now, here's a story. So my dad, being born in the United States, his father said, you're an American, learn to speak English. You're an American. When he goes to first grade, he says, my name is Kaoru. The teacher says, I can't pronounce that. Your name's Peter. Okay, so his name's Peter. And he goes home and he tells his dad, and his dad says, good, you've got an American name. We're going to be Peter from now on. Just imagine if you tried to do that as a first grade teacher nowadays. So, like any American of his age, when he gets to be 21, he wants to join the military to serve his country. He goes and he says, you can't come in because we only want Japanese that can speak Japanese because we can use them in military intelligence. But you don't speak Japanese, so we don't want you. Dad says, I wasn't Japanese enough. I joined the American Army. In 1941 at Pearl Harbor, he goes in and he tries to enlist. And they say, no, you can't do that because you're Japanese, that's who we're fighting. He says, I'm too Japanese now. So he says, I'm not going to join the army, I'm going to go on with life. So in camp, he marries my mom. They get pregnant with my brother, my oldest brother Jack. Jack's born, and the army drafts him and puts him on a ship and sends him off to Europe at age 28. Dad gets on the Queen Elizabeth, or whatever that ship was, and goes across and ends up in Italy. 2 stories about my dad. Oh, maybe not. Anyhow, so he ends up in Italy and serves there. As we go on, there's 2 branches, the Military Intelligence Service, which is where the Japanese Americans help to translate Japanese for Japanese prisoners. And then, keep going, one more. And then they also serve in Europe in the All-Nisei 144th Regimental Company, battalion, and that is, go ahead, combat unit, the most decorated unit in the history of American warfare. 4,000 men who initially made up the unit in 1943 had to be replaced nearly 2.5 times because so many of them got killed. In total, about 1,400 men served, earning 9,486 Purple Hearts and 21 Medals of Honor, because they were on the point of attack in a lot of situations. My dad was a member of the 442nd. At the end of the war, Harper's Magazine writes, though Japanese internment was justified to us on the grounds that the Japanese were potentially disloyal, the record does not disclose a single case of Japanese disloyalty. And no Japanese American was ever convicted of treason during World War II. A couple of white guys that were spies for Japan, they were convicted, but no Japanese Americans. When they came back after the war, this is what they were met with. Next slide. And so it wasn't easy coming back here. But Monterey County was unusual in that in 2016, Tim Thomas discovered petitions from 1945, a collection of petitions calling for residents of Monterey to ensure the democratic way of life of those of Japanese ancestry who would be returning to their homes on the Monterey Peninsula in the months ahead. This is the only thing, and next slide, and they published this resolution here, and they got 400 people to sign it, including people like John Steinbeck, Ed Ricketts, Edward Reston, these artists, Robinson Jeffers. So this is the only place in the United States where something like that was published in the newspaper. And so Monterey County did well to invite the people back, especially to the fishing part of the county, right? Because the Italians and the Sicilians that were fishing used to play ball with these guys, they shared things with them. And not so much in Salinas, because those are farmers, and they kind of liked having that land available to them. So they did this survey, and only one person said that he would support the Japanese return. Keep going, I'm running out of time. And they started this thing called the Monterey Bay Council on Japanese Relations in 1944, which tried to discourage the return to the Pacific coast of any person of Japanese ancestry. So the county was split, but at the end, there are good stories too. One state senator braved political backlash to defend the Japanese Americans. Farmers took care of their incarcerated neighbors' crops, and some of those folks took care of the farms. When they made money, they would send it to these folks in camp, and they took care of it, and then when they came back, they just gave it to them back again. My family wasn't quite so lucky. We had 120 acres before the war, and we had 60 acres when we came back. And we had to live next door to the family that took over that other property. And they paid taxes on it for the 3 years that we were gone, so it was labeled their property. 5 white pastors linked arms to start a mob with guns and clubs from destroying the local Japanese Christian church. So there were good stories as well. In 1988, Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which basically was saying that this was not a great thing to have happened. Next slide. They started this Japanese American memorial to patriotism. If you ever go to Washington, D.C., it's worth seeing. And they have this eagle or 2 cranes, Japanese cranes, wrapped in barbed wire as a central emblem. We started here in Salinas a memorial garden over there by the fairgrounds. And at CSUMB when I was there was an artist named Chiro Obata who did these wonderful paintings of Point Lobos, and we were able to reclaim one of those and we put it up at the university. And that was during the time that the Muslims were being attacked, and so we used that as a teaching element at the university to say, here's a group of people that this happened to, we don't want it to happen again. And the Japanese American community, many of us went out shopping with our Muslim neighbors and things like that so they would feel more welcomed in the community. This is Sally Smith, who is the president's wife. This is Bob Antle's wife, and Chiro Obata's daughter, and then Larry Oda down there. And that's me when I had black hair. And then in February 2018, the Monterey County Board of Supervisors passed a resolution that stated that the county would forever regret its residents of Japanese ancestry were treated with the loss of their rights, property, liberty, and civic standing, and the humiliation and financial losses that they suffered. So, the county's trying to do things to help, but it's been a long time. Martin Luther King says, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. One of the messages I want to leave you with is that those of us that have that connection are really worried about the internment or the concentration camps that we're seeing taking place in the United States. And we think that this is an important issue. And so I don't want to stay on the soapbox for very long, but on something that I really want you to think about, because we don't want that to happen to any other group like it happened to my family. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Okay, so now, sorry, I'm going to go over it just a little bit, but I want to tell you about the Obon Festival. Okay, Obon means it's a Japanese Buddhist custom to honor the spirits of one's ancestors. And so in Japan, there are Christians, there are Buddhists, and there are people that believe in Confucius, which is kind of the Japanese national religion, nationalism. But they can all be the same person. You know, they get married in a white dress, and then they go, you know, to Buddhist ceremonies, and then they go to Obon festivals, which is more nationalistic and things like that. So this evolved into a family reunion holiday. It's been celebrated in Japan for more than 500 years, and traditionally includes a dance known as Bon Odori. Next slide. Obon on the Monterey Peninsula. So we invite you to join us on Sunday, July 14th from 12 to 5 at the Monterey Peninsula Buddhist Church. And this is a whole Japanese American community where we get together and we celebrate Obon. And we have ikebana, that's the flower decorating, bonsai, the little trees and things. We'll have demonstrations and exhibits. My favorite part's here in red. And then there's a number of different events going on. There's demonstrations of Kempo, Tai Chi. If you get a chance to go to the tea ceremony, that's great. Go ahead, next slide. And the minister there does a great introduction to Buddhism, Ikebana, and then the Taiko. The most important things in my mind are, next slide. The tea ceremony at 12:30 and 2:30, if you really love beautiful things and you want to know what that traditional part of Japan history is like, you can sign up for these. They have limited seating, but it's beautiful, and it's something that you want to explore. And in most places, the tea ceremony is celebrated in places where it's really hot, because Obon is a summer festival. But in Monterey, a summer festival means that you can stand to be in this place a little bit longer than you can in other places. So I'd recommend that. And then the other thing that I want to make sure that I recommend is go to see the Taiko group, because my wife, this one here, on the red, and Leslie play in the Taiko group, and they're going to play these huge drums, and they're going to move around them, they're going to play rhythms on them, you're going to feel it as much as you're going to see it. And it's a powerful, powerful experience. Pretty much all women's group, unless Donovan shows up. And, oh, we have 2 men now. So anyhow, it's something that's really powerful, and I think that you'll get a lot out of it. You'll really enjoy it. If you are sensitive to loud sounds, bring earplugs, and you'll still get the feel of it. But definitely go to this. Okay, tell Mom I said that. And then at 4 o'clock, they have the Obon Odori dance, where everybody gets up and dances. I think this is the back of my wife here. And so they go around, they do these dances. If you don't know them, they'll teach them to you as you go along. And then you might see somebody like this beautiful young lady. Oh, wait a second, that's Leslie. I don't know how that got into that slideshow. But you'll see people that are dressed up in kimonos in traditional Japanese garb, and they're glad to help you learn the Obon dancing. So that's what the Obon is about. The Salinas Obon Festival is on Sunday, July 28th at the Salinas Buddhist Temple. You can look this up online. And then I also want to invite you to the Hiroshima and Nagasaki Remembrance. We have this Peace Lantern ceremony on August 3rd at Lover's Point from 7 to 9, where we remember what happened in those 2 cities because of the atomic bomb. And we lead a plea for peace. And there are speakers, one of whom is me, and you'll see the taiko drumming, and then we launch these peace lanterns out onto the water, and it's really quite a beautiful ceremony, so we'd love for you to join us. Last slide. Oh, that's the... So if you need to get a hold of me, here's my email address. And we're going to drop off a pile of the OLLI catalogs here. So so that those of you that want to join us for more OLLI classes, July 25th, we'll drop those off here. You can get online at csumb.edu/OLLI. Find out about more OLLI offerings. We have lots to offer. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.